Hello everyone, and welcome to Straight Chilling. Each week we watch and review a horror film for your entertainment. You can send all questions and comments to straightchillingpodcast@gmail.com, and don't forget to keep chilling.
Yeah, we straight chillin', serial killing. 5 cold villains on the mic, got you reeling. 5-star ratings from the floor to the ceiling. If you get your 1 star, no time for feelings. Got a demon DJ, all the 1s and 2s. By the name Elzebub, so don't get confused. So grab a seat by the fire, roast them all in 2. And prepare to hear the legend of the Straight Chillin' crew.
What up, everyone? It's your boy Soju back with another mini episode. This is a smaller, shorter version of the Straight Chillin' show that you know and love. A little bite-sized version. This gives us an opportunity to cover some things that we just can't get to in our normal show. And today I'm going to be talking about the new Dracula series that is on Netflix. It was actually released on BBC One and Netflix this year. Premiered January 1st, 2020. And it is a 3-part mini-series, with each part being around an hour and a half. It stars Claes Bang, which I had to look up how to pronounce his name. I think I'm pronouncing it properly. He is a Danish actor. I've never seen him. He was in, I think, a movie that won some awards called The Square, I believe. But I've never seen him in anything. But he plays Dracula in this series, and he does a fantastic job. Before I get too far into the review, I'd go ahead and say that I would recommend you check out this Dracula series. Like I said before, it's a 3-parter, but essentially they're an hour and a half, so you're getting essentially a Dracula trilogy, as it were. Each one is like kind of self-contained, but they do build off of each other. The quality, the acting is fantastic, and the effects can be a little wonky at times, but for the most part, actually, it looks great too. So you're essentially getting a brand new Dracula trilogy with this thing. I would recommend it. I enjoyed watching it a lot, and if nothing else, if you think that's just too much time for you, I would recommend at least the first episode. I think you could watch the first episode and be fine if you don't have the time to get through the series. But I really enjoyed it. And before I drop the spoiler warning and talk a little bit more about this, I would just say that I would recommend you check this out. So let me go ahead and drop that spoiler warning and we'll get into it.
Spoiler warning.
Okay, so 3-parter. The first part was my favorite. So the first episode, the subtitle is called The Rules of the Beast. And essentially, it's like our introduction to Dracula, and it's really kind of based more off of the book. So it's kind of like old school Dracula. He's got his castle out in Transylvania. And at first, we're following Jonathan Harker, who is from the novel as well. And he is essentially a lawyer from London, and he has acquired some property for Count Dracula, and he is just kind of showing up to finalize the paperwork and everything. He's got to go there by horse and carriage. And actually, before we even see that, we see Jonathan. He is at this church, and this nun is kind of interviewing him, and at this point he's kind of retelling his story. He has escaped. He's saying he escaped Count Dracula, and he looks really rough. And this is where you could tell like they're really bringing out more of the like horrific aspects of Dracula. I really love this opening scene, and it's really like what caught me, because Jonathan he looks rough. His hair is all gone. He's got these like open sores all over his body. He looks gnarly. And there's this nun who comes in, and she's just like great as well. Her acting is phenomenal. And she comes in and she's got this kind of brash forward type of attitude, kind of like this kind of no nonsense type of attitude, but she kind of even explains she's got this tenuous like relationship with God. She makes this one, she says this one line, she's like, I'm like most women my age where I'm like locked in this loveless marriage. So it's interesting to kind of see this nun's take on God, and she's really interested in Jonathan and his story that he has to tell about Dracula. And so essentially, at that scene, you know it's going to be focused on horror, because there's this one part where Jonathan is sitting there and he's not blinking, and a fly lands on his eyeball, like his eye, and the nun, she tries to kind of be polite, and she has brought in this other like younger nun who is a lot more timid and things. She's like, they're both looking at it like disgusted, and they're like, there's something in your eye, and the fly like crawls into his eye, like in the corner of it, and then like goes behind his eye, and you can like see the shadow in his eye, and he's like, oh, like, is it gone or whatever? And like that, I was just like, holy shit, this might be really dope. And it was. They really lean into the horror aspects, especially in this first part. They show you some pretty gruesome stuff at some points. So essentially Jonathan shows up at the castle, and when he first gets there, Dracula, he's like really old and crusty. He's got this thick like Transylvanian accent and stuff like that. And then as the time wears on, of course, Dracula starts to get younger and younger and younger. He keeps Jonathan there, and his like ploy at first is like, oh, you're going to stay with me for a month and you're going to teach me English so that when I go to England to settle into my new property, you know, like I'll know the ways and everything. So Jonathan reluctantly agrees, and he essentially gets stuck at the castle while Dracula's feeding off of him, and Dracula gets younger and younger and younger, and he picks up this English accent or whatever. And this guy Clace, he kills it, man. He does a great Count Dracula. He's an older guy. Look, he's in his 50s, but the dude's got like the swag of like a James Bond. Like he's just kind of got that thing where he's really charming, and even though like you know he's Dracula, he's just like very convincing, even in the way like he's manipulating people. And like I'm sitting there going like, I know he's manipulating people, I know he's a monster, but like I'm totally buying into this guy. And I think this like take on Dracula where he's just seems very like smart and sophisticated, and but you can see like that dark side of him. He's very manipulative, and this guy like wears his emotion on his face like really well. He can go from very like confident and cocky to there are times of like panic or intrigue, and I just think that this guy playing Dracula, he really does a great job. And I'll get into a little bit more of like the emotions we see from Dracula a little bit later, but essentially Jonathan, he gets weaker and weaker, and he knows that he's got to escape. And he comes across like some other people that Dracula has brought to his castle, and essentially he has drained all these people, but they can't die. They're not really vampires. He just kind of locks them up in crates, and they're crusted, and they can't escape. And Jonathan freaks out. He also comes across one of Dracula's brides up at the top, and she is a vampire, and you kind of see this side of Dracula where he openly says like he's trying to reproduce. So he's got like this very kind of scientific mind. He's trying to like figure himself out. He is trying to find different ways of surviving, and that's kind of his big ploy. The reason he wants to go to England, he reveals, is he wants to feed off these new people, because the way they do this is he gets like memories and knowledge from like the people he eats, the blood that he drinks. And so he's kind of like a little picky, I guess, about who he feeds on and things like that. And so he wants to go kind of feast on the sophisticated people of England. That's kind of his ploy. So Jonathan is retelling his story from this church to the nun. And it's later revealed he thinks that he has written all this down, and he gets very frustrated because he's like, I've kind of, you can just read it for yourself. Because the nun is asking him, like, how did you actually escape from the castle? How did you actually survive? And he gets very frustrated. He says, like, I've written it down. And they're like, no, let's like look at this. And he hasn't actually written anything down. All he is at, like, the words he's actually written is like something like Dracula's my lord or something, or I serve Count Dracula, something like that, where it's like become obvious now that like Dracula is influencing him. He hasn't taken over completely because like Jonathan's like very shocked about it, and he's worried like what he's turning into. Oh God, like I'm turning into a vampire, into a monster. And it turns out like Dracula comes for him. So this is where this this kind of like takes this first episode to the next level. So the nun goes outside, and it turns out that she has really like researched Dracula, and she kind of knows a lot of the lore about him, his weaknesses and stuff like that. So he shows up at the front gates of the church, but he's actually, it's just a wolf. So a wolf shows up, anything, there's like bats flying around, but the nun starts talking directly to the wolf, and she kind of calls Dracula out. She's like, you know, I think you're like Dracula or whatever, show yourself. And this scene was so great. Dracula essentially like comes out of this wolf. So they kind of like show his power. I know sometimes like Dracula can like transform into things, but it all, the way they reveal it is like he was inside the wolf. So they don't even do it like a werewolf transformation. He like, this wolf like tears apart and this man comes out, and they don't even try to do a Hulk style where he's like wearing shorts or anything. This dude's just standing at this church gate. He's covered in like blood and just mucus and nasty shit and like naked. And even then he's just like so mesmerizing because like you get this dark side of Dracula. The nun is like kind of teasing him because she kind of knows his deal, and you get some of that lore from Dracula where she is actually like testing out the things she has heard. So she's like, I don't think you can come in without being invited, and it turns out he can't. And so she kind of teases him a little bit with that. And so you get to kind of like this nun a lot too. Like she's got these balls, man. Like she's kind of testing Dracula, and she like don't really give a fuck. And she like, I just love her attitude. And it turns out, the reason I didn't like say like that, the actress's name or who she played or whatever, is that, her name is Agatha Van Helsing. So like she's the Van Helsing like in this story that they're telling, and Dracula kind of reveals that, like, I don't know if he like pulls it like from her head or whatever, like he's kind of psychic or whatever. But and it also turns out that the other nun that was with them interrogating like Jonathan is Mina, which is Jonathan's fiance, which they kind of like reference a little bit, like it was his like motivation for going on and escaping. Is like, oh, Mina, and she's from the original novel as well. So they brought her into that, and it turns out that like Agatha, the nun, she's been like training all these other nuns to like get ready for Dracula, and so they're all kind of ready with their crucifixes and their stakes and everything. They're like ready to go. And so toward the end of this first episode, there's kind of like a showdown, like how's Dracula going to get in? And at one point, Jonathan is like really terrified because he feels he like starts to almost like attack Mina. And so he tries to kill himself. So he stakes himself through the heart, and Mina's like, oh God, he's like dead or whatever. So she goes out. Well, it turns out like Dracula shows up at the window where Jonathan's body has been like left alone, and he coaxes him back to life. And he's essentially like, Jonathan, you're like a vampire now. You serve me. You can't kill yourself, or whatever. Vampires, they can't kill themselves. So they really get into the lore of Dracula in this series. And I really like that. They touch on some things, and it's just really cool to kind of have them confirm these things or kind of like dissect them a little bit, because they do get deeper and deeper into why he has these rules. And we'll talk about that a little bit more because they kind of bring it up in the later episodes. But essentially Jonathan comes back to life, and he's the one who invites Dracula into the church because he's in there and he's kind of like serving Dracula now. So Dracula comes in and just like slaughters these nuns. It's brutal. The first one you see, he like cuts the main nun's like head off while they're all like got their head down in prayer and like throws it to them. Then he like invites in all these wolves, and the wolves like just tear these nuns apart to where it's pretty much down to Agatha and Mina. And Agatha, like, she's got some tricks up her sleeve. She kind of knows the rules. She surrounds herself, I think, with like pages from the Bible, if I remember correctly. And so what happens is actually she's down there with Mina, and Jonathan shows up. Okay, so Jonathan shows up, and he's like manipulating Mina, and Mina just like wants to kind of believe like, oh, you know, Jonathan's not lost. He would never hurt me or anything like that. And so she invites Jonathan into the circle. And again, like the wolf, Dracula like rips out of Jonathan's body. So it's like not Jonathan, it's Dracula. And he like comes into the circle, and that's where the first series ends. Or the first episode. And I was just like, oh my God. Like, I loved it. I loved every aspect of it, how they touched on. It's got that like old school vibe, like the novel, and just some of the scenes that they did, the effects that they used for the most part, like looked really impressive and brutal, and I loved it. And so yeah, I would absolutely recommend, if nothing else, you check out that first episode. The other two play out like, it's weird how the other two episodes almost play out like the trilogy of a movie. So the second one, it starts off with it's Agatha and Dracula. They're playing chess, and it looks like they're back like in his castle, and their dynamic is really cool because she's really like bold, and he's cocky, and like they kind of feed off each other. They like respect each other, and they're each other's like knowledge, but so they just have like a really great dynamic. And so at this point, he is recounting to her the story of how he is traveling to England. So essentially part 2 is on a boat. So it's kind of like a trilogy, where the second part, it's like a little bit like similar to the first one, but they changed like the setting. So it's still old timey. They're on a boat. But it's just not as engaging. It's not as striking as the first one. So essentially the idea is Dracula is traveling to England, but he doesn't want to stay hidden away. He's kind of arrogant in that way. And so he checks himself in on this like small passenger boat. And he's like one of 8 guests, I think. And he signs in as like Count Dracula, which doesn't really mean anybody to any, or it doesn't mean anything to like anyone at that point. So he checks in. But one of his like big things, this is where like their dialogue, as they kind of flip back to the castle, Agatha kind of like picks him apart. And I love some of these moments, because essentially she like calls him out. Like, he thinks like, oh, I've lived these hundreds of years and I can't be killed. And he's just very smugly arrogant, but like it's kind of justified. But she like gets in his head a little bit, because like Dracula goes on the boat and he can't really control himself. Like, he indulges in like killing people almost immediately. And there's not that many people on the boat. And she kind of like pulls at him. She's like, you know, you think you're so arrogant and stuff, but you can't even like control your urges. Like, you're a glutton, and like you're just like an animal and stuff like that. And you can see like how it bothers him sometimes, the way this guy like wears the emotions like on his face. It's really great to see this character who's like, for the most part, very calm and confident, start to like unravel sometimes when he realizes that like she's on him. Like, she knows like, you know, what kind of makes him tick a little bit. And so those were some of my favorite moments from part 2, is where she's kind of analyzing him a little bit, and you can see that it's bothering him. Essentially what happens in this one is he starts to feed on people, and of course the people are getting suspicious, like, oh, there's something wrong on the boat. People are disappearing, or sometimes they see like blood or something like that. Bad things are happening. Also, like he throws up this fog that he breathes out that kind of like blocks out the sun a little bit, and it follows the boat. And so they're all like very suspicious and everything. So essentially, it turns out he just like keeps killing people, and there's a showdown on the boat again with him versus Agatha and like the captain and the cook, and I think just some kid who kind of like stowed away and is working on the boat, and maybe one other passenger. I can't remember. But that's what it comes down to is they kind of just like have a showdown. Again, they surround themselves with pages from the Bible. One of the guys gets real cocky and thinks he's going to fight Dracula. He gets like ripped apart. And at one point they catch Dracula on fire and they think they've killed him. He kind of falls overboard, but really he just like swam under the boat, climbed up the backside. And it turns out like some people try to escape on a small lifeboat, while the captain, he's going to blow up the ship. And like essentially in Dracula, they think he's like sleeping in like a coffin or something. So they blow up the ship and Dracula sinks to the bottom of the ocean. And that's like the end of part 2, the whole boat thing. Except no, the very end of part 2, it leaves you like on a cliffhanger. So he sinks to the bottom of the ocean. At one point he opens his eyes, he's in the coffin, and he like walks through the water on the bottom of the ocean, and he walks up on this beach, and it's like, oh, he actually like made it to England. And so he like strolls up on this beach, and then all of a sudden the lights from a helicopter and cars and stuff all pull up, and like these like cops or whatever, special agents, they show up and with guns, and it's like, oh, it's the future and shit. And this woman pops out, and she's an agent, and she looks like Agatha, but it turns out it's like, oh, one of her ancestors or something. So now we're like in the present day. That's kind of where it goes. So in the way that this kind of fits in like a movie trilogy is like you have the part 1 that sets everything up, knocks out of the park. Part 2, it's like a little bit more the same, but they kind of dive more into the lore and put you in a new kind of setting. And then part 3 is just like they go off the rails. They're like, oh, Dracula's in modern day. It gets wild in part 3. Part 3 was definitely my least favorite because now they're like in the future. This woman, her name's not Agatha anymore. She's like a descendant. Zoe, I think. Zoe Van Helsing. She's like this agent for this agency that has like hunted Dracula and maybe like immortals. They try to be like real mysterious about it. And they have just like all this high-tech weaponry and all of this like mercenaries and stuff like that. But essentially it gets a little dumb. They capture Dracula. There were some cool moments where he's like just going to this regular house and he's talking with this woman who lives there. And he's just like marveling at the future. There was a cool moment where he turned on her TV and he's able to see the sunset and he just kind of marvels at it. And I thought that was like kind of a cool idea. They essentially, they trap him though, this agency. They grab Dracula and they trap him, but then he like gets out of it because he like gets a lawyer. It's like... It's kind of dumb. He just like kind of outsmarts them because they give him like access to like Wi-Fi and like a iPad or something, and he like hires a lawyer and like gets out on a technicality. It's really dumb actually. And so then it's like Dracula using Tinder and like these dating apps to like find chicks to like feed off of, and he gets this one chick who she's just like really like kind of a shallow person. She's like, I'm not afraid to die. She's really beautiful. And they tell this little side story of this guy who's like in love with her, but of course he's like the nice guy and she kind of treats him like shit, where like she hooks up with him out of like pity and he really loves her, but like she's just kind of this wild person and she sleeps around and stuff. So that's who Dracula chooses is like his new bride. And there is this one cool scene where she keeps saying like, I'm not afraid to die. Like, I'm not afraid of anything. And he starts to turn her And so she's getting sicker and sicker and sicker, and she's like turning into a vampire, and she dies. But he tells her before, like, she has this whole plan where she's like, oh, I'm like going to get cremated and they're going to scatter my ashes when I die. Like, before she knows she's like turning into a vampire, and he's like, don't get cremated. Well, like, she doesn't, like, nobody changes their plans or she just gets real sick and dies. And so they have this funeral for her and she gets cremated. And because she's like an immortal now, she's turning into a vampire. She doesn't, like, it doesn't burn her completely. Like, it doesn't burn her to ash. And essentially there's another like horrific moment where she pops out of her coffin like at nighttime and comes out and like kind of goes on her own killing spree. And it turns out like the guy who's like in love with her, he also works for the agency that Zoe Van Helsing works for or whatever. They know each other. And so they go to confront Dracula like one night. And then this chick shows up, like his new bride. And this is one of my favorite parts of part 3. And she's just like all burnt up. And they finally like do this reveal of like what she looks like. And she looks like terrible. Like she looks like she's been burnt up or whatever, but she's still alive. And the effects on that were like really cool. And so essentially the very end of this is that like Van Helsing, Zoe, I guess at this point, she had drank his blood because they had taken it for like an experiment. And so now she has her ancestor like in her head. And she kind of like reveals all these things about his weaknesses. Like he can't go in sunlight. And then it like turns out like he can go in sunlight. And there was like this thing about he fears the cross. And he gave this one cool explanation at one point, like, I fear the cross because I fed on like peasants for so long and it was in their blood that they actually feared the cross. Like they were scared of God and hell and stuff like that. And it just kind of like it came to me, not that the cross actually has any special power, but it's a result of like the years and years and years I fed on peasants who were like very superstitious. I thought that was cool. Essentially, they just break it down where she's like, no, none of that's true. It's kind of like all in your head or whatever. And Zoe, one of her big things too, is she's like dying of cancer. And Dracula like falls in love with her, or he has been in love with her, I guess like great grandmother or whatever, her ancestor, the original nun. And she has cancer, and so he has at one point he tries to feed on Zoe, but because she's sick, like it's poisoned him, and he commits like suicide by drinking her blood, and they like die in each other's embrace, like in the sunlight. So the sunlight doesn't kill him; he just like kills himself by feeding on this woman who has cancer. So it kind of like ends that way. Like I get what they're going for. Some of it was cool in the way that, you know, they kind of wrapped up the arc of like the nun, Van Helsing, and like how she's really trying to understand Dracula and how she gives him like all these epiphanies about himself, even though he's like super old and super smart, and how he ended up kind of like falling in love with her. Like he was looking for a bride and she challenged him, and none of his weaknesses really were weaknesses. I don't know. It was all right. Just that whole part 3, like Dracula scrolling through Tinder and whatnot. I don't know. I wasn't as about it, but it had some cool elements. Overall, though, I think I'm going to give this series a 4 out of 5. Even with part 3 kind of falling off, I enjoyed the ride. I really just enjoyed the way that this guy played Dracula. I thought it was really cool. And just convincing, and like I don't like the smart and sexy and convincing, manipulative, like it was all the elements that I feel like Dracula should have, and I feel like they captured it very well. But also the times where he was unraveling, I loved seeing that. The chemistry between him and the nun Van Helsing, and how they kind of like played off each other. I thought the chemistry was great for them, and it was just a fun ride for me. So 4 out of 5 would definitely recommend you check that out. And the Rotten Tomatoes is going to be, from the critics, 73%. That is out of 41 critic rating, critic ratings. 41 people rated this movie, 73% overall. Audience rating 694 people, 55%. Wow, I'm kind of surprised by that. So the critics like this a lot more than the audience score. I'm definitely closer on the critics. Mine was an 80% overall. Cooter talk. Let's talk Cooters. His little lawyer, and he's he's played off of like the character from the book. What is that guy's name? Renfield or something like that. He's definitely got the patheticness of a Cooter. He's manipulative. He's not really arrogant though. He doesn't really wear anything crazy. Dracula himself, he's definitely not pathetic. This dude, he's smooth as fuck. This dude should play James Bond for sure. He is manipulative. He's a bit of a sexual deviant. There is one kind of hint that he maybe has sex with Jonathan in order to turn him into a bride or something. I don't know. It was kind of weird in part one. So I think he's definitely a sexual deviant. He is definitely manipulative, and he's got the smug arrogance. So he definitely registers on at least 3 of the 5 Cooter points. Not pathetic. He's actually usually pretty smooth as far as his dressing goes too. So I guess you could say old Dracula, he's a bit of a Cooter. He's a smooth Cooter though, I gotta say. But sometimes you get those, That's why we gotta have the 5 points. They gotta hit at least 3. So Dracula, Cooter. That is our mini episode on the new Netflix Dracula series. I hope you guys enjoyed. We're trying to use this platform as a way for us to kind of get to things that we can't all cover on our big 2+ hour episodes. So I hope you guys enjoy. And until next time, everyone, please don't forget to keep chillin'.